I have presided over thousands of courtroom disputes throughout my career. I've watched witnesses lie with complete confidence. I've watched people forge documents, fake injuries, and invent stories they believe no one could ever unravel. But there was one case that still lingers in my mind. Not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because the deception lasted less than 4 seconds. A man named Julian Vance walked into my courtroom, convinced he had fooled everyone. He was 38, a high-powered corporate consultant with a sharp suit, a sharper tongue, and an ego that seemed to take up more space than the defendant. He walked in with the arrogance of a man who believed the law was merely a suggestion for the common people. He smiled, he lied, and exactly 4 seconds later, his entire story began to collapse right in front of me. Believe me, even after decades on the bench, I rarely witness a lie unravel that quickly. Before we go any further, make sure you have subscribed to this channel for more powerful courtroom stories like this one. Also, comment below and tell us where you are watching this video from. Now, let me take you back to where this case truly began. The defendant was a woman named Elena Rossi. She was 62, a retired schoolteacher, modest, quiet, and clearly terrified of the legal process. Across from her sat Julian Vance. He wasn't just suing her for damages, he was trying to ruin her reputation. The lawsuit involved an alleged collision in a high-end shopping district. Vance claimed Elena had backed her vintage sedan into his imported sports car while pulling out of a parking space. According to his complaint, the impact caused over $30,000 in damage. He insisted that Elena panicked, fled the scene, and only stopped because he had chased her down 3 blocks later. Elena denied every part of the allegation. Interesting. Very interesting. She acknowledged she was in the area, but she insisted she never made contact, not even once. That contradiction immediately caught my attention because one of them wasn't merely mistaken. One of them was fabricating a reality. I asked Julian to describe the incident. He answered without hesitation, very detailed, almost too detailed. He described the speed, the angle, the exact sound of the impact, even the look of terror he claimed he saw on Elena's face. Interesting. Very interesting. Years on the bench teach you that truthful witnesses usually remember important moments, but people inventing stories often memorize every frame of their own performance. That distinction stayed with me. Julian then produced photographs of his luxury car. The rear bumper was mangled. Deep gashes, shattered plastic, and what he claimed was red paint transfer from Elena's vehicle. Everything looked serious, very serious at first glance. Then Elena quietly handed me her evidence folder, neatly organized, every page labeled. Interesting, very interesting. Inside were photographs of her vintage sedan taken only minutes after the alleged collision. I reviewed the first image, then another, then another. Her car appeared completely pristine. No dents, no scratches, and absolutely no paint missing. Interesting, very interesting. I looked toward Julian Vance. He immediately smirked, adjusting his expensive tie. That caught my attention. Years on the bench teach you something else. People who smirk when contradictory evidence appears usually believe they possess a trump card. Julian clearly believed he did. I asked Elena if police had responded to the scene. She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Was a report filed? Yes. Interesting. Very interesting. Julian quickly interrupted. The officer was completely incompetent. He missed obvious details. Interesting answer. Very interesting. Because criticism of an investigation is common, but unsupported criticism carries very little weight. That distinction mattered a lot. I reviewed the officer's report. The responding officer documented the severe damage to Julian's sports car, but one specific sentence immediately caught my attention. Very interesting. The officer explicitly noted, "No visible damage observed on defendant's vintage sedan, consistent with reported impact. No paint transfer detected." The courtroom became quiet, very quiet. I looked toward Julian. "Did you read this police report before filing your $30,000 lawsuit?" "Yes," he replied, his arrogance completely intact. "So you knew the responding officer found no corresponding damage on Miss Rossi's vehicle?" Julian didn't hesitate. The officer was blind. He didn't look close enough. Interesting answer. Very interesting. Because now we had reached an important point. Every qualified, independent observation contradicted Julian's story. Yet his confidence never wavered. Years on the bench teach you that unwavering confidence is not always a sign of honesty. Sometimes it's a sign that someone is so used to bullying others with their status, they believe reality will simply bend to their will. Then Julian leaned forward, smiled that same arrogant smile, and confidently said, "I don't need the police report. I have one piece of evidence that proves everything." Interesting. Very interesting. The spectators leaned forward. Elena remained perfectly still, her hands trembling slightly. Julian reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and carefully removed his smartphone. He held it in the air proudly, like a trophy. This video ends the case. The courtroom fell silent, absolute silence, because according to Julian, he had personally recorded the moments immediately after the collision, capturing Elena's alleged confession before she supposedly tried to flee. If that was true, the case was practically over. I accepted the phone, opened the video, and pressed play. And exactly 4 seconds after the recording began, I noticed one tiny detail, a detail Julian Vance never realized he had accidentally recorded. The moment I pressed play, the entire courtroom leaned forward. Years on the bench teach you that video evidence has an unusual effect on people. Truthful witnesses become hopeful. Dishonest witnesses become anxious. Julian Vance looked hopeful, very hopeful. That observation immediately interested me. The courtroom remained silent. Elena Rossi folded her hands calmly. The spectators barely moved. Everyone's attention was fixed on the screen in front of me. The video began. Interesting, very interesting. Julian's voice could immediately be heard, loud and aggressive. "Look what you did! You backed right into me." Then the camera swung toward his luxury sports car. The mangled rear bumper filled the screen. The shattered plastic, the deep gashes, the heavy red paint transfer covering the silver panel. Everything looked exactly as he had described at first. Then 4 seconds passed, and I stopped the video. The courtroom looked confused. Julian smiled confidently. Exactly the reaction I expected, because he thought I had stopped the recording to announce his victory. Instead, I zoomed in. Years on the bench teach you that people usually focus on the obvious. Judges cannot afford to. Sometimes the smallest detail becomes the biggest truth. I enlarged one corner of the video frame. Interesting. Very interesting. The background. Not the damage, the background. Right behind Julian's damaged bumper, clearly visible in the top right corner of the frame, stood a heavy concrete parking barrier, a bollard painted bright, industrial red. I studied it carefully, then enlarged it again. The spectators leaned forward. Julian's smirk slowly faded because he realized I wasn't looking at his expensive car anymore. I was looking at the background. Interesting. Very interesting. The red concrete pole had a massive, fresh scrape across its surface, directly at the exact height of the damage on Julian's bumper. Silver paint flakes from his sports car were clearly visible, embedded against the red concrete. The room became silent. I watched the first 4 seconds again, then a third time, because details matter a lot. The red paint on his car wasn't from a vintage automotive finish, it was industrial safety paint. I slowly looked toward Julian. "Mr. Vance." "Yes. According to your sworn testimony today, Miss Rossi's red sedan struck your vehicle while she was reversing." "Yes." I nodded, then turned the phone so everyone in the room could see the paused, magnified frame. "Would you like to explain why your vehicle is resting exactly 2 inches away from a freshly scraped, bright red concrete bollard?" Silence. Absolute silence. Julian stared at the screen. Years on the bench teach you something important. People often discover the truth of their own evidence at the exact same moment everyone else does. Julian had just reached that moment. The arrogant executive who thought he controlled the room was suddenly speechless. Finally, he swallowed hard and spoke. That poll was already like that." "Interesting answer. Very interesting. Possible, certainly. But the problem wasn't over, not even close." I resumed the video. The camera continued recording, swinging around the sports car. Julian walked quickly, pointing at his own vehicle, his voice still loud. "Look at this, brand new. Do you have any idea how much this costs?" Then the camera briefly panned toward Elena. She was standing by her vintage sedan, looking terrified, just as Julian had described. But the camera also captured something else, something in the background. "Interesting. Very interesting." I paused the video again. The spectators exchanged curious looks. Julian swallowed hard again. That reaction mattered a lot. I zoomed in on the background behind Elena. There, perfectly framed for just a fraction of a second, was a large, reflective glass window of a nearby storefront. And in that reflection, the entire story became undeniable. The reflection clearly showed Julian's sports car. It wasn't parked, it wasn't stationary, it was reversing. quickly, and right behind it, the bright red concrete bollard. The room became completely silent. I watched that fraction of a second again, then a third time. Because physics rarely lies. People do. The reflection showed Julian reversing hastily, clearly not looking, until crunch. The impact against the bollard was visibly jarring, even in a reflection. Then, the reflection showed Julian pulling forward, stopping his car, and immediately turning his aggression toward the nearest, most vulnerable target. A 6'2" woman in a vintage sedan who happened to be parked 3 spaces away. Interesting. Very interesting. I slowly looked toward Julian Vance. Mr. Vance? Yes, Your Honor. His voice was barely a whisper now. The booming confidence from 10 minutes ago had completely vanished. According to your video, your own video, you didn't just back into a concrete pole. You then decided to blame the nearest elderly woman to cover the cost of your negligence. Silence. Absolute silence. Julian stared at the floor. Years on the bench teach you something important. Arrogance is loud, but guilt is incredibly quiet. Julian had just reached the quiet part. I was confused. It happened fast. Interesting answer. Very interesting. Possible? Absolutely not. Because the problem wasn't over. Not even close. I looked at the timestamp on Julian's video and compared it to the police report. Mr. Vance, your video was recorded at 2:14 p.m. The police were dispatched at 2:28 p.m. You had 14 minutes to realize you hit a pole and not a person. 14 minutes to look at the massive red scrape on the bollard behind your car. Instead, you spent 14 minutes terrorizing Miss Rossi. The courtroom remained perfectly still. The spectators were stunned. Elena Rossi let out a long, shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. Case dismissed, I announced, my voice echoing in the quiet room. And Mr. Vance? I suggest you hire a better driver, because your current one seems to lack both vision and a moral compass. I awarded Elena Rossi her allowable court costs. Julian didn't argue. He didn't smirk. He simply turned and walked out, his expensive suit suddenly looking very cheap. Years later, I still remember that hearing. Not because of the expensive car, but because it reminded me of something every courtroom eventually proves. Power and privilege might buy you a nice suit and a fast car, but they cannot buy reality. Julian Vance walked into my courtroom convinced he was untouchable. He believed a rehearsed story and a loud voice would be enough to intimidate an elderly woman and fool a judge. Instead, 4 seconds of his own recording quietly exposed everything. Because evidence doesn't care how much money you have. It doesn't care how important you believe you are. It simply waits until someone takes the time to look closely enough. And in every courtroom I have ever served, the truth has one remarkable habit. It always leaves a reflection. As the gallery began to murmur, and Julian Vance reached for the heavy oak doors to make his swift exit, something entirely unexpected happened. Something that completely changed the meaning of this entire hearing. A man stood up from the very back row of the spectator seating. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, wearing a conservative, impeccably tailored suit that commanded immediate respect. He carried an air of undeniable authority. I recognized him immediately. Marcus Vance Sr., a highly prominent real estate developer in the city, Julian's father. Julian froze. His hand stopped inches from the brass door handle. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of relief return to his face. He puffed out his chest and stood a little taller. Years on the bench teach you how to read a defendant's reliance on privilege. Julian clearly believed his father was about to intervene, to use his immense wealth and influence to intimidate the room and clean up his son's mess. He believed his family name would protect him. He thought power would carry him out the same door he walked in. He was wrong, very wrong. Marcus Vance Sr. didn't look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed. That distinction mattered enormously. He didn't walk toward his son to offer comfort or legal defense. Instead, he walked directly toward the plaintiff's table. He walked toward Elena Rossi. The courtroom became completely silent. Absolute silence. The spectators, who had been whispering about the video evidence, stopped moving entirely. Marcus stopped a few feet from Elena, respectfully removed his glasses, and looked the elderly woman directly in the eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying across the quiet room. "I sincerely apologize for my son's appalling behavior today. He was raised to respect others, and he has failed completely." Julian's face lost all its color. His rehearsed confidence evaporated in an instant. "Dad, wait, you don't understand," he stammered, stepping away from the door. Marcus didn't even turn his head. He simply raised one hand. It was a gesture of absolute, unyielding authority. "You will remain quiet, Julian," he said coldly. "You have spoken enough today, and every single word was a disgrace to this court and to our family." Interesting. Very interesting. I watched this dynamic unfold carefully from the bench. Years on the bench teach you that arrogant people usually crumble the exact moment their safety net is removed. Julian's safety net had just deliberately cut the cord. Marcus finally turned to look at his son. I studied the father's face. That wasn't anger. That was a decision. "I gave you that car as a promotion gift," Marcus said quietly, though everyone in the silent room could hear him. "And you used it to terrorize an innocent woman to cover up your own careless driving. You thought your name made you untouchable." The spectators leaned forward, holding their breath. This was the exact moment privilege met reality. "You will pay for whatever damages you caused to that parking lot," Marcus continued, his voice echoing. "And you are suspended from the firm, effective immediately. We do not employ liars." Julian looked devastated. He looked toward me, then toward his father, searching for a loophole, a final excuse. But there were no more loopholes. Power was never meant to be a shield, and justice certainly doesn't care who your father is. The courtroom remained in that state of stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. Julian Vance, a man who had walked in with the swagger of an untouchable corporate titan, now looked entirely broken. He didn't say another word. He didn't argue. He just slowly turned, his shoulders slumped, and walked out the heavy oak doors, completely alone. His father, Marcus, stayed behind. Interesting. Very interesting. Years on the bench teach you that true power doesn't need to shout, and it certainly doesn't need to lie. True power is accountability. Marcus Vance possessed it. His son only pretended to. Marcus approached the bailiff, handed over a business card, and quietly instructed him to ensure Miss Rossi received full compensation for her time, emotional distress, and any travel fees she might have incurred, despite my official ruling already covering her legal costs. Then, he turned to me. We didn't speak. We simply exchanged a brief understanding nod, because in that moment, we were both judges. I had judged his son's legal liability, but Marcus had judged his character. And honestly, Marcus's verdict carried a far heavier sentence. Elena Rossi gathered her neat, organized folders. She looked exhausted, emotionally drained, but deeply relieved. She had walked into a legal battle against a man with unlimited resources, a man who thought he could use the legal system as a weapon to cover his own incompetence, but she walked out victorious. Not because she was louder, and not because she was richer. She won because she simply told the truth. As the courtroom slowly emptied, I sat alone at my bench and reviewed the evidence folder one last time. The 4-second video, the police report, the reflection in the storefront glass, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. People often believe deception fails because someone is smarter. In my experience, deception usually fails because reality leaves fingerprints everywhere. Julian Vance believed a carefully rehearsed story, a damaged luxury car, and his family's influential name would be enough to rewrite history. Instead, 4 seconds of his own recording quietly exposed everything. Because evidence doesn't care how confident you sound, it doesn't care about the price tag on your suit or the connections in your phone book. It simply waits patiently until someone takes the time to look closely enough. And in every courtroom I have ever served, the truth has one remarkable habit. It always leaves something behind. Character is what remains when power fails. Next time you see someone hiding behind a name or abusing their privilege to intimidate those they deem beneath them, remember this case. Remember the 4 seconds that brought down a man who thought he was untouchable. The gavel had fallen, the courtroom had cleared, and the case of Julian Vance was officially closed on my docket. But years on the bench teach you that the true verdict of a case often plays out long after the litigants leave the courthouse. Interesting, very interesting. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of that 4-second video began to surface. You see, when a man builds his entire identity on the foundation of someone else's power, the collapse is rarely quiet. Julian's suspension from his father's real estate firm wasn't a temporary measure meant to teach him a lesson behind closed doors. It was absolute. Marcus Vance Sr. made sure the business community knew that his firm did not tolerate fabrication, bullying, or cowardice. Julian, the man who walked into my courtroom with a designer suit and an untouchable smirk, suddenly found himself entirely unemployable in the circles he once commanded. Without his family's name shielding him, His reputation preceded him. People who once tolerated his arrogance now refused to return his calls. That distinction mattered enormously. Power can demand compliance, but it cannot buy loyalty. The moment the power evaporated, so did his entire support system. On the other hand, there was Elena Rossi, the quiet, terrified, 62-year-old retired schoolteacher who simply brought the truth to court. True to his word in the courtroom, Marcus Vance Sr. personally ensured that her vintage sedan was fully inspected by top mechanics and that she received a substantial check for her emotional distress and time. But more importantly than the money, Elena received her peace of mind back. Interesting. Very interesting. I later learned that Elena had used a portion of that compensation to start a small community fund for retired teachers in her school district. While Julian Vance used his privilege to tear a vulnerable woman down, Elena Rossi used her unexpected restitution to build her community up. That observation stayed with me a lot. Years on the bench teach you how to observe the trajectory of human character. When arrogant people are finally held accountable, they usually spiral into bitterness. They blame the judge, they blame the system, they blame the lighting in the video. They will blame everything except their own reflection. Julian Vance became a ghost in the city's corporate scene, a cautionary tale whispered among junior executives about what happens when hubris meets a concrete bollard. But the most fascinating part of this entire aftermath wasn't just Julian's professional ruin. It was a secondary piece of information that surfaced weeks later, a minor detail about that specific supermarket parking lot that made his 4-second lie even more ridiculous than I had originally realized. The moment I opened a piece of supplemental correspondence a week later, I couldn't help but shake my head. Interesting. Very interesting. It was a routine maintenance log from the property management company responsible for that high-end shopping district. They had submitted it to the court clerk to officially assess the property damage Julian Vance had caused to their concrete bollard. I read the report carefully, then again, then a third time, because every sentence mattered. According to the property manager, that specific concrete barrier wasn't just painted red for aesthetic reasons. It was a heavy-duty security bollard protecting a newly installed fire hydrant. But here was the detail that completely shattered whatever was left of Julian's fabricated reality. The bollard had been freshly repainted with high-gloss, industrial safety paint exactly 1 hour before the collision. The courtroom was empty now, but I could vividly imagine the look on Julian's face had I revealed this during the hearing. The red paint transferred onto his expensive sports car wasn't just a matching color to Elena's vintage sedan. It was literally still wet. If Julian had bothered to touch the damage, if he had taken even 2 seconds to genuinely inspect the supposed evidence of his victimization, he would have found sticky, wet, industrial paint on his fingers. But he didn't. Years on the bench teach you something incredibly important about arrogant people. They never look for the truth. They only look for a target. Julian Vance was so accustomed to his privilege, so used to bending the world to his convenience, that the moment he felt the jarring impact of his own terrible driving, he didn't check his surroundings. He simply looked around for someone to blame. He saw a quiet, elderly woman parked nearby in a red car and decided her reality was his to manipulate. That distinction matters enormously. People who invent stories out of pure entitlement rarely pay attention to the tiny details because they truly believe their status makes them immune to scrutiny. Julian believed his expensive suit, his luxury car, and his aggressively loud voice would completely overshadow the facts. He thought he was the smartest, most untouchable person in the room. But justice doesn't respond to volume. It responds to evidence. I often think about Elena Rossi driving away that afternoon, her reputation completely intact, and her vintage sedan perfectly spotless. She didn't need a team of expensive lawyers to defend her. She didn't need to raise her voice or invent a spectacular lie. She simply brought the truth and waited patiently for it to be heard. A lie, no matter how confidently delivered, always requires dozens of explanations, shifting timelines, and rehearsed outrage. The truth usually needs only one look. Julian Vance walked into my courtroom convinced he had fooled everyone. He believed his power would carry him out the same door he walked in. Instead, exactly 4 seconds of his own recording stripped away his privilege, exposed his true character, and left him with nothing but the humiliating consequences of his own deception. Because in every courtroom I have ever presided over, reality has a way of speaking for itself, and when power finally fails, character is the only thing left standing.